Frankie,
Ian!
how's it going, buddy?
What's up? How are you?
Awesome, man. Awesome.
I didn't offend anyone in your life today. I didn't say anything about you being magnificent or being an SOB or anything. So it's not as colorful as I like, but it's more PC.
My mom will appreciate that.
Yes, yes, yes.
We are talking about something that we've done all too much of today. And it started with a conversation that you and I had about how, after a long period of a good economy, as soon as the brakes are put on, there's a recession and we're in the middle of COVID, how embarrassingly simple it is to do a first round of layoffs. And that really starts with hiring mistakes, which is what we're going to talk about on this podcast today, is hiring mistakes we've made as new managers. And that I think that the title of that is loaded with hubris, because the truth is we actually make these hiring mistakes still today on a regular basis. I mean, there's not much in our outline that we went through that is strictly something we did 10, 15 years ago. We continue to make these mistakes. We just make less of them today. But I think today's recession is no different than a much bigger recession that you and I both went through 2006, 7, 8, 9, working in the housing industry, and really anyone's industry went through that period during that 5 years, probably, if you think about it.
For sure. And I think what we're not going to talk about today is firing fast, right? So like what's hiring mistakes we made as new managers. As seasoned managers, we know two things. Number one, we're going to make mistakes. And number two, we're going to just have to fire people. And a secondary conversation about this is going to come into, when do you fire? But yeah, it's a recession is the magic elixir. It brings out like, okay, it's time to be honest about this, and let's go through kind of with the axe. And nobody ever wants to do that, but that's what you have to do.
I think an interesting point here, in 2005 is when I came to the real estate business. That's when I joined a large home builder in 2005. Frank had already been with the company 7 years at that point.
Yeah.
So all you had known in the home building industry was go, 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 grow, 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 sell, 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 raise prices, add people, go, 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 go. I had just left General Electric. So we were going through, I was in a totally different market. So I was in an industrial business. We sold to steel, to paper, to different industries. I was accustomed to shrinking staff. I was accustomed to running a business with very lean margins where, and coming from a company, a Jack Welch culture of the bottom 10% go every year. The culture at MVR was not like that at all. You couldn't afford to get rid of anyone. You kept people that weren't the greatest. And so talk a little bit in 2006, you've gone from in the passing lane for 7 years to now having to go rationalize your workforce. What were some things that stood out to you as a new manager having to go through that process?
Nobody was ready. And when I mean nobody was ready, I mean the managers. Like we had a culture of people who did not know how to fire people. And like we were fortunate, we had a handful of managers who did. Like Kenny and Rayner were both really good at it, and they kind of set the tone, but everybody was trying to protect people. And it was like, there was almost a reckoning of, we can't protect everybody. The market sucks. Like, we're making changes. And what they ultimately did is they fired a high up person. Like it came out that they had like a secret meeting in like a shitty hotel off the side of like a back road highway. And they had a meeting where there was literally like a bed over here and 5 chairs, and like the people who are making the decisions, because they didn't want one of the senior level people to know. But once the senior level person was fired, people kind of realized, okay, we need to get on board here, or they're going to lop our head off next. But it was like, nobody was prepped and ready for it. It's like kind of like, a kid that's played video games his whole life going to the military, like you can't do a pull-up, like you're in trouble.
Yeah. And so as most companies do, you are given an arbitrary number that started up top. You know, if you have a team of 15, you're told 3 need to go. Or if you have a larger, the bigger your team is, the larger the number is that you have to go figure out. So as you're looking at your list and you're thinking, okay, I have to go tell these handful of people that they're gone in this first pass, as you're looking at the list, how difficult was it to bring up names?
So this is how I think we should start it. So 1998 to 2005, like it's a rocket ship going up, like a rocket ship. They've got me on campus and I'm like 7, 8 weeks out of college and they had me recruiting and bringing people in. And I was still young enough where I looked like I was still in college. So like, and I was single, like, you know, I was like hanging out at fraternity and sorority parties, like having a blast. Like it was a party. And that's how hiring was for 7/10 of a decade, a very long time. And then when that changed, it wasn't like, I mean, you and I never really talked about this. It wasn't like I had to fire 3 people. They're like, we're closing this division. Like I went from like, we're hiring anybody we possibly can to we have 75 employees. We're probably firing 50 of them. So it was the opposite of let's start with the list of like who's going. It's who's staying. The title of this is hiring mistakes. Like at the end of that, there was probably of the 60, 75 people that worked in that office, we reallocated some. We probably fired 50. So we fired 2/3. And like a decade later, I look back and these people were in sales and construction. And now they're like selling used cars or they're school teachers or they're stay-at-home moms. Like we had the wrong people in all the jobs. It wasn't like there was one job. Like we were completely just like, come on over, just jump in, like plugging people in and thinking we could make people good hires because we had too much faith in ourselves. And that wasn't the case.
That's fascinating. So, you know, that big a group of people are gone, and in the moment, it's, oh my God, how can we lose all these people because you hired them? But looking back on it with a few years, when we started hiring again, you looked at that group of people and you weren't asking them to come back.
That's
You
right.
weren't calling any of them. You were hiring a totally different person, which says that during those go-go days, you were making a hell of a lot of hiring mistakes.
Yeah. And so the way it happened, we had a 75-person division. And the first was like, all right, we need to make pretty significant cuts. Like I remember finding like 22 people in one day. That's a significant amount of your staff. And then in quick succession, maybe like 6 weeks later, and then another 3 weeks after that, we'd fired like 50. So like the second and third time, you're somewhat callous to like how shitty this person's day is going to be. Like you still realize it, but it's like, oh, but it just becomes part of it. But I'm going to kind of fast forward quickly. 2020, we fire 25% of our workforce in one day. Like March 20th, I let go of 25% of my workforce because I was petrified about COVID. But what did we do? We looked at it from the standpoint of, okay, we're probably going into a deep recession. Sales saves businesses. We're going to give people different comp packages. And the comp package that we're going to hire is highly incentivized, low base, because it makes my overhead as a business owner in better shape. I can weather more storms. Not one of the 25% that we go back and hire. Not one. And like someone was trying to get a job who I had let go, and their new hiring company calls me up and they're like, would this person be eligible for employment? And like, I understood the question, like you're checking the box. You're just asking me so I said, sure. Yeah, they're eligible for employment. But like internally, I asked myself, why the hell would I have fired them if they were available for employment? Like I would never hire that person again, because even though you have all these disciplines, history repeats itself and you find yourself in the same position.
So, 15 years later, the numbers aren't as big. You don't work for a publicly traded company anymore, but you find yourself that you make some of the same mistakes. I think we're going to talk about today how a strong economy and a growing company can push you to compromise on some of the good habits, the standards that you've built for yourself, the systems, the processes, because damn it, we need people, that's been at the crux of almost every bad hiring decision I've made, is the pressure to help the rest of the team and get more resources in to support something growing too fast.
So you asked the question about the first round of layoffs. And when you're at a publicly traded company, you have 401k, you have benefits, you pay well. Like, their friends have been working. We had a sorority at Virginia Tech where we would hire 3 or 4 of the women who graduated every semester for like 5 years. So it was like a gravy train. Like, they would hand pick the girls that they wanted to come work with us. It was awesome because it was just like, it was robust times of hiring. But this is what's funny between working at a publicly traded company with a good reputation and being on your own. Like, I remember trying to hire people when I started my business, and I would think back to all the people I fired, and I would be thrilled if any of them would come work for me because the bar was so low on who was willing to work for me when I first started a business. So it's all relative to where you are in the cycle, both the economic cycle and your business cycle, on who you can attract and who you can physically hire.
That's fascinating. That same thing for me at General Electric. I could attract, late 90s, while Jack Welch was still running, I could attract any engineer I wanted and anyone, honor students, 4.0s. You get to NVR, it's a different world. You're not going to Georgia Tech and getting a 3.8 GPA. We could get MBA kids. It was a different bar to get into NVR. Just, you couldn't hire the same talent. But then when you look at a startup, I'm the same way. I'm like, well, I don't have all the benefits of NVR even. I have to, compromise. I have to find freelancers, contractors, different people. And the same with you. When you're starting a business, you're convincing anyone to come in just to help.
That's right.
So Frankie, we put this together in a top 10 format in no particular order. But the first one we're going to talk about, because we both had a lot of trouble with this as young managers, is being overly focused on someone's personality. So the way you say it is, I want to hang out with this person, right? So it almost sounds like how a fraternity would, go through their rush process of, we want to live with this person, that type of thing. So talk about the first person you can remember where you just made a pretty big mistake along this lines of hiring someone that you wanted to hang out with.
So there was this like handsome dude. He grew up in like California. He was like sun-kissed, and his name was Casey. He went to like a private school in Connecticut. And like, I looked at this kid, I'm like, man, that's a pedigree I wish I had. Like, and I remember like we in the old days, we used to take people out to a recruiting dinner the night before, get them all lathered up and excited about the company. And the next day we would bring them in. And then our process back then, which was similar to yours, is we would have an individual interview with a group of people. And then we would sit around a table. And like, if there was 4 interviewers and 4 interviewees, there'd be 4 separate people around the table. And then we'd get out kind of a matrix and we'd score them and we make a decision as a group. And I was advocating for this guy because I like, in my head, I'm like, this dude's just going to be fun. Now, ultimately, I won the argument. We did hire him and he was a decent hire. He wasn't terrible. But if I'm being honest, years later, I was hiring a buddy. Someone I wanted to hang out with. I thought he could do the job, but I wasn't coming from the same perspective as I would as a business manager. Like, you and I both don't hang. It's very rare. I've got 30 some odd people that work for me. Almost none of them I hang out with. I hang out with maybe 2. And that, like, when you're a kid hiring, you want to hire friends. When you're an owner or a senior level person, you want someone who can do the damn job. And that changes drastically over time.
This one really got me thinking, Frank, because, at my first company, I definitely fell for this where, you go to a college and you do college recruiting and you're trying to find people like, oh man, because you're closer in age, at least, especially I was younger. So, we were both the same, 23, 24, 25, I'm on campus interviewing and looking to hire. So I'm only 5 years separated in age from some of these folks. So it was very easy to see who was like me, who wasn't like me. And I think the older you get, when I think about some of the best people who ever worked for me, I hardly ever hung out with them outside of work. Like some of them were polar opposites from me in personality, things they enjoyed doing. A lot of them were very different in age. Some had kids when I was still younger. And they were incredible employees, incredible people to work with, but not a lot like my personality. The longest tenured person that worked for me ever was about 13 years. And she and I thought very similar in business, but outside of work, we didn't have a ton in common that we were doing. And we worked together amazingly for 13 years, but we didn't hang out hardly ever
Right.
personally outside of it. And that really, none of that matters. None of that matters, but it's very easy when you're sitting one-on-one in front of a desk with someone, because outside of work, that's what we've been doing our whole life. Even when you're a kid in school, when you go to college, what do? You try to go find people with similar personalities to you to hang out with. But how many of our closest friends would we hire? Not a lot. Not a lot would we hire, because there's different work ethic, they're different skill sets. So I hired my share of cases like you did, where I was trying to hire a spitting image of myself, and it rarely worked well.
When you're young as a manager and as a hiring manager, like everybody falls for this. The just like you think you can do the job, so you try and find more people like you to do the job. And we've kind of transitioned from being focused on someone's personality to just like me bias. These are kind of two really big hurdles that you have to get over. And I think with Ian and I had similar careers in similar kind of time frames. Like we were handsome kids, we were smart, we were fun, we were hardworking. Like we fit in great on college campuses. So like I was still figuring out what my primary job was, and I was being asked to go like recruit people. Like it's very hard to do those two things. So your default is, well, I'm going to just find somebody like me. But if you're hiring for that particular job, maybe that's okay. But if you're hiring for a very different job, like I hire now for admins, I hire now for salespeople, property managers. I'm not built for those jobs. I'm terrible at those jobs. I know how to manage those jobs, but you can't. That's where like recency bias or just like me bias or personality, that's not the chops for that job. And you've got to, but mistakes have been made multiple times by me in those positions because of it.
So just like me, bias is number two. And I am absolutely vulnerable to this day. And in fact, people who worked for me on panels, there would be times where I would come in just excited, and they would be like, "Oh, shocking. Ian likes the kid from Michigan." And they would all kind of laugh, because I'd be like, "Well, there's good stock in Michigan. They're all, they work hard." And I made a mistake once in Virginia. So I worked in Virginia. All I really saw were Virginia Tech, George Mason, JMU, University of Maryland.
Right.
I saw other kids who graduated from colleges in Virginia and Maryland. Never saw people from Michigan or Purdue or, where I grew up from in Midwest. And one time I'm looking at a resume of someone they sent me, and there it is. Engineering degree, Purdue University, great GPA. And I was hyped. I mean, I literally, Frank, I wore my Boilermaker tailgate helmet into the interview just to like get a reaction out of him. He was like, "Oh my God, you're from Purdue." And I'm like, "Yes." I came into that so excited to see another Purdue engineer that wanted a job. And to the point where, in hindsight, the clues were everywhere. So I was interviewing for a loan processor job, but a loan processor has to be able to connect with customers, has to be friendly, has to be real patient. You can't be a perfectionist, because things go wrong all the time and processors have to give lots of bad news. Well, this guy, I'm an engineer, but I'm very opposite from 90% of the engineers that I knew at Purdue Engineering. Most were introverted, quiet, couldn't even make eye contact with you in classes. I'm not any of that. I went right into sales. I just had an engineering degree. This guy was more like what I saw on campus. He was very introverted. He was shy. And if I was even trying to look for the warning signs, they were everywhere. Well, he ended up being a great kid and really smart, and a disaster as a loan processor. His manager had to make every tough call for him. And by the way, loan processors make bad calls every day. So he wore out his manager who always had to do the bad work for him. But the job in itself ate him alive. He couldn't handle not being perfect. He couldn't handle the fact that there was no solution for everything. He was a bad hire and it was all my fault. I even overrode the branch. I was like, the manager's under me, like, we got to hire him. This guy's smart. He's West Lafayette. And it was just a terrible move on my part, but it was just like me bias. Even though he wasn't just like me, he was sort of like me because he went to Purdue and he had an engineering degree. He had enough that had me excited.
So I'm gonna take this in a different direction. So let's say you're listening to this podcast and you're thinking about interviewing. This is what the power of modeling is. Like if you go into an interview and you're sitting across from someone, you can't, unless you want to lie on your resume and say, I also went to Purdue and I got a great degree in engineering. But if you model the person sitting across the desk from you, that you can get them to have you fall into the just like me bias. What you can do in a lot of interviews, especially with people that are senior level that have big egos, is you get them to talk. And they walk out of the interview and they think you were great and you didn't answer any damn questions. I interviewed for a vice president's position and I knew one of the guys interviewing me had a huge ego. And I just kept telling him, I saw you do this for years. He's like, yeah, you're right. He would get into it. And he would ask me another question. I'd give it back to him. And I was told through feedback that I should have never gotten that it was the best interview he'd ever done. And he talked 80% of the interview and I got the job.
I think I know what you're talking about too. And I could see that strategy working on this individual.
Yeah.
100%. If you don't do homework, and very simple homework, you can find all these things out on LinkedIn, by the way. All you have to do is Google Ian Mathews if you're going to interview with me. And you could find out very quickly that I'm from Michigan, that I root for Detroit sports teams, that I went to Purdue. And if you bring these things up, you are going to get me blabbing without me even noticing that you're doing it to me. So I think Frank's advice is brilliant. You get that. You try to find parallels that you have with that person, things that we have in common. And so that when they leave the interview without even knowing it, they're thinking, man, that they're just like me, and you will get hired. Just that simple. It's really that simple.
So the next thing on our list, and you're usually the one who drives the agenda, but I think this is a perfect segue, putting way too much emphasis on first impressions in an interview. Let's just say you did what Ian said. You go to LinkedIn and you look one of us up. And an interview is usually 45 minutes to a little over an hour. In our company, you'll interview with a couple of different people, but you're going to sit with me for 45 minutes to an hour. If it's a higher level position, I might bring you in a couple of times. But let's just say in 10 minutes, what we talk about is things you did on research. You come up with, like, it's very hard to not get the tide of the interview going in your favor. And by doing some of that just like me stuff and talking about it and complimenting my business or talking about things that you know about me, most people are lazy and they don't do that. So if you show up in an interview and you've done some of that work, I'm going to kind of give you time to see, wow, what initiative you've had. It starts rolling in your favor. And then when you talk about first impression, if you're flattering the person you're working with or interviewing with for the first 5 to 10 minutes, it's very hard to have a bad impression of that person to start. As younger interviewers, we would have fallen prey to that. Now we kind of realize, like, all right, great. Thank you for doing research. It's really awesome. Let's talk about you. But at the same time, like, that's a really good way to start to build momentum if you're in the chair interviewing for the job.
Even a seasoned interviewer like Frank, who knows what's happening, is impressed that you did something that 99% of people are too lazy to do. So if I come in there and I'm interviewing for a project manager job, even any of the lowest level jobs in Cava companies, and I say, Florida Gator, huh? Were you there when Spurrier was there? What was that like? What was that like seeing, being in the swamp? And even if Frank knows what you're doing, he can't help but start smiling and talking about the swamp and he's a big Gators fan. And then if I lead next to, you were at MVR a long time, 13 years. What made you leave to start your own thing? Get Frank talking again. That's his baby. He's talking about two things that are important to him, NVR, Cava. Even if he knows what you're doing, he will be impressed that you gave a shit to spend a little time to learn about Frank Cava and the person that you're interviewing with, because that sends a message that you're a person that comes to meetings prepared, that you don't do things off the cuff, that you like to be organized, those things all send cues. They're not tricks. That's just you showing you care enough to prepare enough to connect with someone. And if you're willing to do that, you'll be willing to do that with Frank's customers, with the people that you work with in Frank's office. You are giving us clues about the kind of person you are.
Exactly. And the right way to do it is to do it subtly. Oh, you were at NVR. Tell me about that. What did you learn? Oh, you were at Florida. What did you like about it? What did you learn? If you go into my website and you start trying to be cute or technical or try to trick me or try to like impress me because you read something, you're going to trap yourself and you're going to fall right into it. But if you're asking open-ended probes, basically like Ian said, you bring up the fact that I worked at Ryan Homes. You bring up the fact that I went to Florida. You bring up the fact that, you know, I've worked in the Charlottesville market. It's like a good TV show. A good show doesn't need to tell you what they're doing. It unfolds in front of you in a great story. And as an interviewee, if you make the person interviewing you realize I'm smart, I can be subtle, I've done research, I distinguish myself from the crowd. Plus, you're playing to all these human biases. You're going to set yourself on a completely different trajectory during that interview from people who don't.
Yeah. And I think, you know, as an interviewer, so as an interviewee, those are things that you can do. But as an interviewer, you have to be very careful. Primacy bias is very strong. So primacy bias is just we remember most what is presented, the information presented to us first. So first impressions. Um, I know for a fact I have quit on people that made a bad and first impression on me where I shouldn't have. And I have an example on this. Um, One time I invited a new manager to sit in with me to see how I interviewed. And by then I had interviewed over 1,000 people. So I was pretty seasoned. And this guy was interviewing for a sales trainee position where we would teach him how to sell, and could not have he was so nervous, and it was really obvious. And no matter how many softballs I gave him early in the first 5-10 minutes to show a little bit of his personality, none of it came out. And he just was nervous. He came across as introverted. He made no eye contact, limp fish handshake, handshake wasn't great. And I was just like, oh man. And if this other manager wouldn't have been with me, I would have ended this interview after about 20 minutes politely. I just would have cut the interview from 45 minutes to 20, because I pretty much had given up on him. But the fact that she was there and she wanted to practice interviewing, I kind of gave it to her. Would you like to ask some interview questions? And of course she did, because she had just gone to a class. And so she had a list of like 12 that I hadn't even bothered to answer because I wanted to leave. I wanted it to be over. So she starts asking open-ended behavioral questions. And one by one, he starts knocking them out of the park. Like answers that I was like, wow, whoa, that's pretty impressive. Like things he had worked for a small shop owner and things he had done to grow business. And by the end of this interview, I was like, damn, I really like this kid. And we gave him a job, and he turned out to be phenomenal. Like one of our best hires. He just knocked President's Club, year one, high volume, incredible hire. And truthfully, I would not have hired him if I had not had a trainee interviewer with me going through the process and asking good questions. So even after that much experience, I'm still susceptible to primacy bias, to first impressions.
So as an interviewer, I want to point this out. If the person does something critically wrong, like they do something that just shows incredibly bad or flawed judgment, I will cut them. Like I'll be like, we're going to end the interview early. I won't say this, but like in my head, I end the interview early. But as a seasoned interviewer, if I have someone who is nervous or who screws up or who goes down the wrong path, I always I'm self-deprecating. And I say, hey, I got to be honest with you. I'm just so happy I'm on this side of the table. Being on that side of the table, I remember it's stressful. Like I would always wear like layers and jackets. And you know why I would never take my jacket off? Because I'm sweating. Like I would just put my jacket on and I would just sort of seal in all the juices.
Covers
So
up
no
the
one,
sweaty armpits.
oh, just the whole your armpit, back, rear end, all of it. But like I would say something like that. When I was in an interview, I never took my jacket off because I was always sweaty. I'm like, can you relate? You dealing with any of that? I was like, I have an entire hour blocked out here. What I'd like to do is take that first 7 minutes and just push it to the side. And I was excited to meet you. Why don't we start over? Why don't you tell me what, like, why you want to be, like, get them to get back on that track and get them, like, but because two things happen. If they're shitty, you're going to cut them anyways. But if they're great and that person ultimately works somewhere in your company and you gave them a second chance behind closed doors, you're going to have an incredible ally. So if someone has a stilted beginning, help them. That's okay. Like that's some of the stuff we would have missed in the beginning because Ian wanted to be hard and I was worried the person would embarrass me in the panel. But that's okay. That's what management is. And that can be your first opportunity to show what working for you is like.
So Frank and I have different styles. And I think when you're starting off as an interviewer, you definitely have self-doubt. You're going to have the imposter syndrome of who am I to evaluate whether someone should be here? What do I know what I'm doing? And my default, which was very opposite of Frank's, but my default was to try to be the toughest interviewer. I wanted to be, a couple of things. I read about how Google interviewed and how Silicon Valley interviewed. And I would ask dumbass questions like how you would get out of a blender if you were shrunk down, or why are tennis balls fuzzy? I remember I used to ask them to estimate how many leaves were on the same tree that was in an interview room. And, I would just, say, well, I want to analytical. I want to see how you estimate. And what I learned nothing from any of those questions. Those are stupid ass questions. And I think they're stupid for places like Google to ask them too. All of that is when you ask a really complicated hypothetical question, like how do you get out of a blender? That's people at Google trying to prove how smart they are as interviewers. And all that really does is turn people off. I found there was no value in being the toughest interviewer on the panel. And I wanted to be known as that. If there were 5 people and that person started, I wanted to be like, Ian was the toughest by far. I wanted to see a bead of sweat coming down their forehead in the interview, or I would ask challenging questions, just to do it. I was a prick for 10 years when I started as an interviewer. And I had a situation that changed that. So I interviewed for, this was probably like 2009, 10. I almost left to go take an executive role at a company in Chicago. And I got through a couple of different.
I remember this now that you're bringing it up.
So I interviewed with the CEO of a publicly traded company, and he was an absolute ass. And, went out of his way to let you know that, he was in charge and he was a difficult interview. He was particularly contentious about my resume, what I had accomplished, would insult salespeople in general, even though I was hiring for a VP of sales job for this company, insulted his people. He did these like little tricks where he would tell you this is an intelligence test, like right in front, so get through all this interview. And I'm like, wow, I bombed that. And this guy's a dick. And he's like, I got to tell you, this is one of the best interviews I've ever done. We would love to have you join us. And I'm thinking to myself, I wouldn't work for you if you paid me 10 million a year. You are an absolute asshole. And what the hell makes you think I couldn't get out of that office fast enough and send them a no thanks letter fast enough. And it totally changed my whole mindset about interviewing. I became a totally different person. After that day, I wanted them to say like, I liked Ian the most out of that, because I realized I would have left NVR. I was gone. I was leaving for Chicago, if not for that CEO turning me off so much. And it was like, all you had to do was recruit. You could have still been a relatively tough interview, asked me the right questions, but you did zero recruiting. You just wanted me to think how smart you were and how difficult it was to get in your company. It had the opposite effect. It made me not want to work there. And it changed the way I completely thought about how to interview people. I quit trying to be a tough interviewer, and I started trying to connect with people and make them think by the end of the interview, he's challenging, but that's a dude I would love to work for. And I never used to think that way before that interview.
So there's a couple ways I can go with this, but I'm going to ask you a question. To me, that shift fits amongst a larger, more macro question. Like, what changed for you during that interview? Like, to me, there's one fundamental thing that changed. Besides, don't be a dick. What was the other fundamental thing that changed?
I think perspective. So I'm not a person that's interviewed a lot in my life. I've worked for 2 companies, and aside from at college, I really didn't interview much when I worked for either of those 2 companies because I was just focused on doing what I was doing. So all of my interviews were internal, and so going through a process where I was serious about going to work for another company. That was the first time I got the perspective, uh, in a while, of what it was like to sit in front of a demanding, tough interviewer. So my lens changed, where my lens was almost always being in charge and being the decision maker, to being someone who had to sit on the other side and make a decision. And I think a big perspective change, just kind of an aha moment of, oh shit, in an interview, it's not just one person making a decision, it's 2. They're both interviewing each other. And I was there trying to decide, do I leave a good company, move back to Chicago, change everything? I was undecided. I was interviewing that CEO. Is this guy better than the CEO I work for now? Is he someone I'd rather work for than the one I have already? And he didn't think of it that way until it was time for him to convince me. He waited way too late. I formed an opinion. Then he tried to recruit me, and it was way too late. And my perspective changed that day. I started thinking about every interview, there are 2 people making a decision, and they are interviewing me the same.
So the light bulb that I was trying to drive at is the interview is actually about them. It's not about us doing the interviewing. And that was the moment where you felt it because the spotlight was shown on you. But as you get back behind the desk and you get to do your job and you get to interview that person going forward, you realize if you're good and you're subtle and you're the Sopranos, or if you're Quentin Tarantino, if the script is well written, you're constantly getting at what you need, but you're also selling, and you're showing what it's like to be under your umbrella or to be with you. Like, that guy was just pushing you away. Like, I don't want to work with this asshole. And I remember, when I graduated from college, I had 13 job offers. And I remember being like, I would not take that job no matter what they paid me. I do not want to go anywhere near that. The work sucks, the people suck, the environment sucks, they're being jerks. But the other part of it was just that interaction, that discourse, and what you choose to ask really can set the tone.
Yeah, I've found, even though I did it for the first 10 years of being a manager, I've found there's zero value in being known as a tough interviewer. And if you interviewed with me in 2006 and you interviewed with me in 2012, you would see a totally different approach, a totally different process, and you would walk away with a very different opinion of me. Because if you do choose to work for me, I also don't want you to be scared of me. There's no, if the people that choose it, when I was a tough interviewer, they were scared to death of me when they saw me. They were always thinking I was going to be that way, and they would see that I was a little different as a manager, and it was probably confusing. So you might as well be the person you're going to be as a manager in that interview, because I wasn't like that as a manager.
And as a senior level executive or as a business owner, we're already intimidating enough. Like, I come in on the phone. I'm always waving to people while I'm doing 6 other things. I'm big. I'm sick. Ian and I are relatively, we're big. We've got big stature. We're bigger dudes.
Your title's intimidating. You're the owner. You make financial decisions about these people's lives. You have enough respect by the nature of your title and your position, your authority.
So let's completely overcorrect, and let's go to the other side. This is me when I first started as an interviewer. I was too easy. Like, I would want to spoon feed the person the answers. And that's not the right approach either. Like, I wanted, if we would interview 4 people, I wanted all 4 of them to be job candidates. And that's not the way it works. HR doesn't do that. HR usually puts you with one or two good people and one or two shitty people. So you realize how good the two people are that they want you to hire. So you hire one or two of them. So from that perspective, like the answer is usually in the middle. And as we both got more skilled, I got tougher, Ian got easier. And the reason is we both, our default was wrong. And we both had to kind of adjust our approach so we could be better interviewers. We could be truthful, we could be tough, we could be supportive. The goal is to find good, hardworking people that we can empower. That's what we ultimately wanted. The interview was about them, not about us. And once we figured that out, we got better.
Yeah. You want them to be excited when they get there. You want them to want to work for you. You want them to just be running in on their first day to work for you as a manager. If you've done your job well in an interview, that's what you've done. That's what you've kind of created. So a little bit different. Number 6 that we had on our list that we came up with is the opposite of the first thing that we talked about. So the first thing we talked about is overly focused on personality, soft skills. Number 6 is overly focused on technical skill. And I'll include GPA in this because you and I have hired for a lot of different technical skills. But I know I used to look for very high GPAs when I hired at GE, which is ironic because I didn't have a high GPA. But I knew that having the brand of GE allowed me to go get the upper echelons of GPA, and they never worked out. They struggled to take direction. They wanted a very step-by-step process of what it took to be successful, and the business doesn't work that way. There's not a quiz every day. There's not a test. There's not something to turn in. You have to work independently. And over time, I started putting 2 and 2 together that a sweet spot for me was like 2.9 to 3.4. 3.4 to 4s just didn't do well because I didn't have time to give them a quiz grade every day. They wanted to be graded on everything, and it didn't work well for me. I did much better in the 2.9 to 3.4 area.
I think it depends on what you're hiring. Like if you're hiring someone that needs, I don't know, like, you're repairing an airplane, that requires a level of skill. Like there needs to be something that you know what to do. It's highly technical and it's very precise. GE felt to me very precise. NVR wasn't as precise. Like what we would do is we relied on NVR on our training department. We relied on the fact that we would build a bench. We didn't really need you to produce for a while. So we could bring you in and you could work under someone as a project manager, work under someone as a sales rep, and you had time to build the skill. The 2.9 to the 3.4, they're hardworking people. That's like a 3rd round draft pick or a 4th round draft pick in the NFL. You're guaranteed nothing. Like every single week you could get cut. So you're going to work your ass off to keep that job, where the 3.4 to the 4.0, they're used to a very different type of a life.
Yeah.
In my business, what I hire for, I never wanted the technical, but I needed you to be somewhat trained when you got here. I don't have a deep training department. So you need to have some of the skill and you need to have some of the ability to kind of learn as you go. And then we're going to kind of make you kind of fit into our box, but a lot of it's back on you. So, and that's hard. Here's a great example. Like, Angelo, who works with me, I can't pick salespeople. I suck at it. Even in my job, I can't pick it. So what we do now is we have 5 tests a salesperson will take. And I usually don't like the ones who are great. And Angelo in the interview usually I usually like the ones who stink. I can't, it's recency bias. It's my own personal opinion. But if you can look at the test, you understand that stuff, and then you can kind of build okay, these people kind of resemble each other. Then you can build the avatar better, which is very hard to do when you first start.
Yeah, and I think that takes, that's impressive on you that you can just be honest about that. For someone who's hired salespeople for 20 some years, that you can still say, damn, I just miss more than I gain. So I need some people around me that are better at picking these individuals and not just keep banging my head against it. Cause that's a weak spot for you, and you're trying to get better at it. You're trying to get your arms around it because it's costly to hire bad, but that's not an area you're great at. So surround yourself with some people that are a little better at it. And Angelo's done a lot of it too. And if he's a little better, lean on his opinion more.
He interviews them first, and then they come to me, and I check on personality, I check on integrity, and then I sell.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. So when you're overly focused on technical skill, what you're not focused on is cultural fit. And that's number 7 on our list. And I think it goes together well in technical skills. So when I've not focused on cultural fit, and a lot of these mistakes, I'll just preface by saying, normally it was when my business was growing too fast and I needed to hire lots of people, not one. When you have to hire one people, you don't make a lot of these mistakes. You're overly careful. You check 1,000 references. You have a large panel of people interviewing. You look at 10 candidates to hire one. You're very careful. When you're hiring 10 people, it's a different story. And so this was like 2013. Rates were low. In the home building industry, people were poaching left and right. We were just woefully understaffed. And there was an office near our office in Frederick, Maryland. There was a Wells Fargo office, and people were leaving there in droves. And ultimately, we've learned why people were leaving Wells Fargo in droves. Their culture was just acidic. It was toxic. They were opening account. They were putting so much pressure on people. They were opening fake accounts. Wells Fargo still has trouble today. It's just a morass of toxicity. But I saw it on the front end where people were running. And we hired one, and similar to your sorority story, she told us, hey, look, there's a lot more like me. And she did good initially. She was really good initially. Technical skills they had underwriters, processors, and those are very technical jobs. And we were dying for people that could just take 50 customers and start working their deals right away. We didn't have time to train you for 9 months out of college. And so she got us like 15 resumes. And Frank, just because she had some early success, we just hire. We hired like 10 of them, right?
Of course. Yeah.
And then they got in and they brought all that toxicity with them. We didn't, and I missed it too. We didn't dive into culture fit. We didn't dive into their part of the problem. All I saw was these are 15, 20-year employees of Wells Fargo that were willing to leave. So I was like, wow, they were loyal to Wells that long. They had great job stability, and not job hoppers. They're going to be loyal to us. But what I learned was, if you're willing to stick around in a company that negative, that terrible, how talented are you? How confident are you? I learned something completely different. Like they weren't as good as I thought they were. And in fact, they brought all that gossip, all that negativity, all that time. And 2 years later, we had to get rid of all of them. We had to start all over again, but it was awful. Not only were they not performers, they were HR issues. The amount of headaches that I got out of that Frederick office by hiring overly focused on technical skill because we had gaps in our staff, I paid for it for years in performance until we could clean it all up. And we just went all on the other side where we were like, we don't want anyone with mortgage experience. We're going to hire them all ourselves and bring it up because, and we were willing to deal with that just to get our culture right. And it was a disaster.
Big boiler room. We don't hire brokers here. We train them.
That's about right.
Wells Fargo was so much better when it was in California, and it was like the guy on like the ox-drawn wagon. There used to be some like real mythic quality to it, and it is just shit. I think on the cultural fit side, to me, and a lot of this comes back to arrogance and ego. Hiring mistakes are a lot about arrogance and ego. And in the beginning, we didn't know what we were doing. So they got to be like me. It's the bias, right? Because we didn't know our chops weren't good enough. When you start looking at downtrodden people or people who are not the right fit for you, what you got to be very careful of is you have built a culture, and what is that going to come around to? So there was a guy that came up in the last 6 weeks. Everybody in my network said this guy was great. So I talked to him, Angelo talked to him, we're getting excited. We tested him, like everything is good. And it just started coming around to he was negative. He was working in a position where he was making like under $2,000 a month on average. So like, you're willing to do that? Like, what's wrong with your psyche? So but these are things you miss on the first pass. And when I told him I wasn't going to hire him, this was his quote. Well, I want to rip off your face and shit down your neck. He literally said he literally said that to me. And like he was asking, he was like pressing me for why aren't you gonna hire me? And I told him, like, you know what? That's why. Like, we sensed that this was back here. And thank God we saw it before you got here. But Angelo and I have interviewed like Angelo's interviewed 4,000 or 5,000 people, and he sniffed it. And then he brought it to me and I was like, yeah, there's something there. And we agitated it. But like, that's the stuff that you've got to be so careful about. And you and I have fired lots of people. It's always better to be conservative on the front end with someone who is toxic than to there's things to take risk on, and toxicity is not it. Like it'll do so much more damage.
Yeah. And, you said he was working for an extended period of time for less than $2,000 and complaining about it the whole time. A lot of times managers will say, wow, that's loyalty. They're not job hoppers. They're going to stick with us too. But you got to ask yourself, what's up with that person's self-confidence? If they can work in a terrible, toxic environment for less than market for years, and do they just enjoy being a part of drama and negativity? Because a truly talented person that knows their worth just won't stick around for that. So who are you really hiring? I never found value in hiring someone that was overly loyal to a toxic, terrible company that didn't pay them well. That's not someone I want. They have no confidence. They like drama. Yeah, that's not going to help you.
Like if you're willing to stick around for that, why? Like your confidence is broken. You can't figure out, like, I can go somewhere. I know how to sell myself to launch into something else. That's what it is. So I think the subtlety in this is really important. It's the why. Like, don't mislabel it as loyalty or as perseverance. It's stupidity. It's lack of self-confidence. Like, those are not people you want.
Yeah. I'm going to move on to number 8 here. Most interview classes, you leave most interview classes with a list of questions, a guide. They give you, they teach you how to look for certain attributes, and there's 15 to 20 of them you could look for: resilience, time management, organization, a top achiever. You look for all those things. And one thing I did that I think it diluted my interviews early on, and I've moved away from it over time, is I would build my list of questions, and I was looking for 15 different characteristics in every interview. So I would ask one question about time management, checked off the box. One question about drive, check the box. One question about self-learning. And I would go through 15 of these and ask one question. And over time, I've realized that there are not 15 things that I highly value. And, no person is great at 15 different things. What I look for are, what are the 4 or 5 things that are just non-starters with me? You got to have it. Resilience is a big one for me. Great teammate is a really big one for me in everything I've ever done. Problem solving. I have like 4 or 5. And what I do now, instead of asking one question, after you give me an example, I'll say, that's great. Tell me another. Tell me another. Tell me about a time where you didn't do so good in this area. I'll ask 4 or 5 in the same thing, but I pick the traits and behaviors that are just most important to me and that I know fit with that position. And I don't try to go an inch deep and a mile wide. I go a mile deep and an inch wide on the things that really matter to me. That's something I've changed a lot. And I think I'm more effective as an interviewer now. I get into what I want more.
The first thing I could think about is what my wife would say if she heard you say an inch deep and a mile wide. She goes, that's what she said. But
100% Ellie would say that.
But yeah, it's so funny because you have this pressure when you don't know what you're doing. I usually agree. Let me ask you this question. In a great interview, How many questions do you ask in a great interview?
See, does that count like me
Main
saying what
questions.
else? Tell
No,
me
no, no, no,
more.
no. Those are probes. So like for me, in a great interview, I might ask 4 to 6 questions, but I
Mhm.
might keep probing. I might keep asking. I might say, "Oh, that's cool. Tell me a little bit about this. Tell me more about that." But it's 4 major questions.
7 to 10 for me tops, and that includes like rapport building, but each one has a series of 6 or 7 probes.
Yeah, and I was leaving rapport building and kind of what questions you have for me out. It's somewhere between 7 and 10 questions. If you're in an interview and someone asks you 35 questions, don't expect to get a job. Like it just is.
They're inexperienced and they're just note takers. That's what you're
Yeah,
doing there.
but let's answer this from both sides. As an interviewer, if you're asking a question and you get a great interview about or great response on like problem solving and tenacity and follow through, why don't you ask about planning and organizing there too? It sounds like that was a hell of an accomplishment. Like, how did you set up for that? Like, that's the person's already in it. Like, just dig a little bit more. Don't close it up and say, okay, do you use a day timer? That was like the old question. Like, those are the little things that you can kind of get nuanced in and kind of pull out while you're in the process of that. And then you can say, you don't have to be across the board on stuff. Like, if you've got integrity, if you've got follow through, if you're someone who seems to be relatively intelligent but knows how to adjust, like that's about what it takes to get a job.
Hmm.
So like as an interviewer, if you're getting those things out of somebody, that's what it's all about. Like can you pull that out in the interview?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't have a lot else to add on that. I mean, I think that's a really good way of saying it is, less questions, more probing. I've evolved to that over time where I have my questions and I I think what's different about that also, Frank, is as a rookie interviewer, I don't know I was really listening. I was just trying to write notes because I was trying to get through all my questions.
That's right.
And now I don't really, I take some notes, but I don't have a list of questions. I might write a few words down of things that I would like to know, but I'll ask a question. I'll really just listen and I'm really in tune to it. It's like a good salesperson doesn't ask questions just to ask them. You're listening and new questions are forming in your mind because you're trying to find the predicate to the subject. You're trying to describe more what they're trying to explain. You're getting more color. And so I listen better to the story you're telling. And I try to really understand your role in whatever situation you're explaining and how you were able to get success. And I'm a little more effective by just listening better.
So to me, a new job, I know we're going to move on. I want to just add this. To me, a new job or a new responsibility or promotion is basically your ability to take what you've learned, compartmentalize it, and then adapt it to your new environment. So if you go from being a project manager to a production manager, you're managing people who are in that role. So how do you then take it's formulaic and like you and I have been promoted a bunch of different times, but we use a lot of the same stuff over and over and over, and the process is very repeatable. So if you're in there kind of talking about like an example, I love to ask, do you have another situation that's resemblant of that? And the reason I want to ask that question is I want to see if they figured out that there's a pattern and there's repetitive stuff and they've already learned the lesson. Are they starting from scratch? To me, that doesn't show a lot of chops. No, they use that same foundation they've used once before and they're building off of it. Oh, this is something that's good because they're going to come here and there's going to be differences. But do they know how to be adaptable? Do they know how to take those things and then interpret it next? That's a big deal.
So adding to that, I love that point. You pair questions. So I might ask you to
That's the way to
tell
say it.
me about a failure in a certain area.
Yeah.
And one, I'm trying to see, are you confident enough to admit to failures? And are you going to give me a juicy one? Because if you're going to give me a juicy one, that tells me a lot about your confidence. If you just give me a little softball and try to not admit to something going wrong, it tells me that your ego is bigger than your humility.
We don't have a lot of depth.
But after that failure, I'll say, you know, thank you for sharing that. That's a crazy story. Tell me about a different situation, but one that ended with a little happier ending. Or, maybe I'll ask you to tell me about a great success you had. And then after you tell me that, be like, Tell me about another situation where, you were presented with it that didn't end so great. And so I'm always kind of trying to see, give me the yin and the yang, give me the positive and the negative. Do you learn from mistakes? How are you changed as a result of your failure? A lot of that, I think, Frank, just teaches me about your growth mindset. So I would never ask, like, tell me about your growth mindset, or tell me about a time where your growth mindset came through. No, I'm just asking about other behaviors that have failure involved in it. And then I'm trying to dig in of, what'd you learn? Tell me about another situation that came up that you learned from that, where you were a different person. And if they struggle with that, then there's a good chance that they struggle with growth mindset in general.
That's right. And that to me is the difference between like a crappy movie script and a Tarantino. It's you're getting at the same thing, but you have some dexterity in how you're asking, you have some skill and some tact of how you're getting there, and you're trying to get it out of them. And the other thing is too, by learning the yin and the yang and asking these different questions, you're going to get the best out of people. You're giving them every opportunity to thrive in the interview, which is what we want. And,
Yeah.
and if you don't have the chops, you're not going to get the job, but we've done our part to get it out.
And I think, the last one, and this one you presented, Frank, because I couldn't resonate with this one, but I do think that this one comes in line again with business conditions lowering your standards to an extent, where interviewers are different when they hire one person versus they need to hire 20, and just in general. Doesn't matter what market you're in. But one that you brought up was choosing a candidate with your heart and ignoring some warning signs. So I guess I'm heartless because I could not come up with one example of ever doing this. I was probably on the other side of this. But I guess, where are you going with this? Share some of how you did some of this when you were a new leader.
Sure. So like, I almost felt like it was my responsibility as an interviewer to make that person work. Like, I didn't understand how companies worked. I didn't realize HR people, like at NVR, we had an HR person who would build a panel of 3 to 4 people. And what they would usually do is they would put 3 people, 4 people in front of you, and they thought maybe 1 or 2 could do the job. And the other 2 people were there. They weren't immediately sign-offs, but they weren't good enough. And they would really highlight how much better the other person was. I didn't know that at the time. So I would always think like all 4 of these people we should be hiring. So I would be like trying to give them the answer or trying to steer them in the right direction. Or I'd be, the worst of it is when I wasn't being honest with myself. I wasn't being honest that this person can't do the job. And I'd be sitting in a room with Paul Mock, and I'd be like, no, I think I can get this guy to perform if we hired him. And he'd been around 20 years. He didn't want that guy on the staff because he knew it wasn't going to work. And but for me, I was thinking, no, I'll work harder. I'll get the most out of them. Where what I've gotten to is a more heartless place of, if you don't have the skill set, I'm sorry, this is just not the right opportunity for you. And it took me a while to get there.
I think that goes in line also with, when a new manager inherits a team, you
Yes,
inherit a
very
team of
much so.
15 people. There's always 2 people on the team
I need to
that
go.
don't have the skill set. And that natural competitiveness of the manager comes out of, I can make this person work.
That's right.
I know I can develop them. I can train them. I can teach them. And 12 months later, they're the same person. Nothing's changed. You put a ton of effort and time into it. You ignored the other 13 people on the team, and you're in the same place. You have to get rid of them and replace them. Once you've done that and gone through that kind of, and when you had 7 years of an up market. You weren't getting rid of anyone because you needed everyone. Even the bad ones were getting results because the market was saving you. So you didn't learn that lesson quickly. Whereas I kind of learned that lesson fast because I had to do some layoffs early and I had to fire people quicker. So I think maybe I didn't have that challenge because I was in a different market than you that was slow and declining, and you were in a crazy rocket ship up market where even the bad employees, you kept them around because they could get satisfactory results.
I use this analogy a lot when we do these podcasts, and I talk about developing different pitches. You know a lot more about baseball than I do, but I had a fastball 7 years in. I knew how to hire. but I didn't know how to fire, which is a second pitch. I didn't know how to cultivate. I didn't know how to put someone on performance management and get the best out of them. Those are things I had to learn later because the market bailed a lot of these things out. So I could just get away with only having one pitch, so to speak. But a rich and full career is going to be many oscillations and many changes and many different aspects to your job. And you're going to have to do all of these things if you're going to be great. If you want to be good, you can get away with one or two, but to be great, you've got to have all of it.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to wrap this up by just saying, I desperately hope that the Ford family watches our podcast, because they've hired like 27 head coaches since our last championship in the 50s. And they're really, really shitty at hiring general managers and coaches. So really, Detroit Lions, this is for you. I'm going to at you. I'm going to maybe hashtag you a little to see if we can get you to learn from Frank and I, and the Lions won't be so crappy. Maybe the Dolphins could learn from it. Good hire on Shula. Not much sense.
So you brought up sports. I'm reading the book Dynasty. I texted you about this. It's awesome. Like I'm a Dolphins fan. I hate the Patriots, hate them. And it's incredible. All the little things they do that fit so well within this outline, like why they hired Belichick. Everybody disliked him. Nobody liked him. But Robert Kraft saw someone who had skill and who was willing to be a contrarian. Like all the things that we just talked, like athletes, if they're stale, they get rid of them before, not after their prime. Like there's all these little things that are so tangential to what we just talked about.
100%, man. 100%. Frank, if I ever get the chance, I will definitely hire you, my man. And that would not be a mistake.
Thanks, Ian. Nothing would make you happier than to be my boss, to get to bark at me and then boss me around. Just an FYI, I'm in charge around here, not Frank.
The only reason I'm doing this podcast is I get to kind of tell you what to do sometimes, and you just kind of follow orders on this.
When Ian and I did a deal, he told everybody, he's like, just to make so everyone's clear, I'm now Frank's boss.
I'm now Frank's boss. It's very important to me. I don't need to be paid for that. I just want everyone to know that that's the situation. All right, man. Have a great day, buddy. I hope you hire well today.
You too, brother. Good talking to you.
See you, man.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it.